And so we want to look at this tonight. I titled the message, A Promise of Goodness. And so Paul writes, verse 28, just diving right in the middle of a book, of a chapter, and of a larger thought. He says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called. Notice the definite article there. A specific group of people. It is to those who love God and to them who are the called according to His purpose. Well, what if I told you tonight that God was only interested in doing good for you? Well, if I was to say that tonight, you probably wouldn't think much of it. You would probably respond something similar to this. You'd probably say something to the effect of, I believe that, preacher. Yeah, I agree with that. I know that. I believe that as a Christian, that God's really only interested in doing good for me. But what if I told you this evening that God will never allow anything bad to happen to you? I believe there would be several possible responses to that. If I were to just stand here and make the unsupported declaration, God will never allow anything bad to happen to you, there would be several possible responses. One response would be this. Some would take that statement at face value and just leave out of here hoping for the best, because that's just what some people do. It doesn't matter what you say to them. They just take it and run with it. Well, we may call those the naive people. They never search out a matter. They just kind of take it. It doesn't matter what the preacher or speaker or teacher or guru says. They just take it and run with it and hope that what they said, if it was positive, comes to pass. Another response would be that some of you would immediately accuse me of being a prosperity preacher. You would see me like the Creflo Dollar or Joe Osteen or some of those fellas. Thank you, by the way, for putting me in that group. I believe a third response, and probably the majority of individuals here, would just simply say, well, I don't believe that, preacher. And I would say the majority of us would say that because our own experience has told us that bad things do happen to us. Haven't you been there? Where bad things just happen. I think that's the inevitable question for the child of God, is to say, why do bad things not just happen to good people, but why do bad things happen to God's people? What I hope to accomplish tonight, however, is to show us this evening that there is a certain group of people, and I want to underscore that. There is a certain group of people that God has made this promise to. God has made a promise to a certain specific group of people that He will never allow anything bad to happen to them. And I'm going to show us tonight, to prove that, four factors, what we're going to call them, four factors here from Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that's going to prove that very truth to us, and really the truth's relevancy in the overall arching plan and purposes of God. So we're just going to work through these four factors together tonight, probably very briefly. How many of you believe that? Yeah? Yeah, nobody believes that at all. Okay. Factor number one, we're just going to jump right into it tonight, okay? The premise again is that there's a certain group of people that God has promised He will never allow anything bad to happen to you. Which means if you're in that certain group of people and something bad happens to you, God's not faithful to His promises. That's what it means when we say God has promised something. We mean that God has declared something to be so, and if it's not so, then God's not faithful to His promises. But the good news tonight is God's faithful. But we're just going to see how this thing plays out in the Scriptures for us. Okay, so the first factor, you can jot it down, is what we're going to call the inclusion factor. The inclusion factor. So notice with me, if you have your Bible, so open there to Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Notice the two huge words, all things. You might want to underline that or maybe just write it off to the side somewhere. The inclusion factor is noticing those two huge words, all things. Now, I call them huge. There are really only 9 letters between both of the words if you take away the space. But they encompass the world, really. And that's why I'm referring to them as huge. They make, those two words, all things, really fabricate for us one of the largest statements in all of the Bible. Here's an all-inclusive statement. Here's the Apostle Paul on behalf of the Holy Spirit, on behalf of God the Father, saying all things. Not some things, not a few things, not the majority of things, but all things. Now what exactly does the Apostle mean by all things working together for our good? Well, let me clarify that in a negative sense, because I am a Baptist preacher and I think very negatively most of the time. Well, I do not believe that Paul means every single minute action or reaction that occurs in life. Let me illustrate that, okay? If you were tonight to raise your right hand and to slap yourself across your right cheek, we would laugh at you. We would think you very odd to do that. But that action would have no bearing on the overall plan and purposes of God. That would be an insignificant feature of life. That's not an event, an action or a reaction that is going to serve to chart the course and overall direction of your life. The same thing would be true of you stubbing your toe. You know, we lived, when we were growing up, we would, as kids do, you wake up in the middle of the night, you can't go back to sleep, or you had a nightmare, or whatever the case is, and so you may get up in our house in the middle of the night and just walk through the hallway, through the living room to get to Mom and Dad's bedroom, and we had this fireplace, and in front of the fireplace there was this stone mantelpiece. It was a stone mantelpiece designed to break your toe. My left little pinky toe is forever scarred because of this. After I got married, moved out of the house, started a family of my own, had children I was raising up, then my dad decides to cut the mantelpiece in two so that you don't do that anymore. Because he sleeps on that side of the house now. Because him and Mom have some obvious marital problem. The problem is he snores. So, I've stubbed my toe I don't know how many times on that mantelpiece. And I've got to be honest with you, I don't know if it's really affected me that much in my life. It didn't chart the course, the direction that my life was to be headed in. So what I mean by that is those are insignificant things. And I don't think that Paul's statement, all things, is inclusive of those sorts of, whether you get a double cheeseburger or triple cheeseburger, is not going to really relate whether you lead your cousin to the Lord or not. Does that make sense? So I don't think he's speaking of those things. By the expression, all things, I rather believe that Paul is intending to include all those events that steer the trajectory of our lives, like a rudder on the ship. These are, Paul is thinking of those experiences, those events, those time periods in our life that are really shaping and molding us and determining where we're really going to go in our lives. For example, the all things I believe that Paul would be alluding to here would be things, and this is an exhaustive list, but it would be things in the category of where you grew up, or how you grew up, or where you moved to, your successes, your tragedies, your education, where you were educated, how you were educated, to what level you were educated. Your wealth, how much money you have, where you work at, what kind of career field you entered, who you work with, who you work beside, who you work for, who you interact with. It would include things as far as not just your accumulation of wealth, but even your ignorance or even your poverty. God has used and is using and will continue to use those sorts of experiences to shape the direction of your life. I could better call on your own testimony for that. That if you hadn't have grown up where you grew up, if you hadn't have moved to where you moved to, if you hadn't have married who you married, if you hadn't attended the church that you attended, if that person hadn't knocked on your door, if someone hadn't given you a gospel tract, if you hadn't have chosen to visit that church, if you hadn't have taken that job, if you didn't work beside that person in the factory, whatever the equation is, God used those things in the words of the book of Esther to bring you to this place for such a time as this. All things are working together for good in your life. God has used all of these things. And what the apostle's premise here is that he's using all things for good, not for bad and not for evil. So this is the inclusion factor. It is God using all those significant events of our lives. The next thing we want to see by way of these factors, number 2, is the ultimate factor. The ultimate factor. And to see this, we're going to move on here to the next 2 words of verse number 28. And the next 2 words of verse 28 are work together. Work together. All things, the inclusion, what's included in that, work together. So what do these words, work together, really do for the text? Well, what they're doing is they are taking the all things, these significant events and experiences of our life, and they are now mixing those events together. Instead of looking at them as isolated events over an extended course of time, now we're seeing them all being put into the same mixing bowl. They are being worked together, if you will. Now let's look at this progressively this evening. First of all, every individual thing that God has allowed in and by His providence is not necessarily good in and of itself. Okay? Cancer is not good. Liver disease is not good. A loved one's death is not good. A lost job is not good. And couldn't we just kind of go on and on, etc.? We could all think about isolated events and experiences and time periods that when we just look at them, we would have to put a stamp on them that says not good in and of themselves. But progressively, we would move to a different statement. And we would say that as we begin to add all of these individual events together into the same mixing bowl, as it were, in that place, the badness of those individual events begin to disappear because they're now being worked together. Those events begin to work together to make something good. And so what individually by itself hurt and was painful and caused whatever damage it did, now when you're taking all of those events and you're putting them together, now we have the formation of our lives. Now we're here. Now we're interested in God. God's got our attention. Now we hold a Bible in front of us. Now we wouldn't dream of not coming back to church on a Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night. Now our family's in church. Now we're dedicated to living for God. God's working things together in our lives. In fact, He's working all things together in our lives. And so He's mixed them together. God promises that He's going to make something good out of all those things by mixing them, working them together. Which brings us to a next point, a next statement. Ultimately then, and there's the key word here. Okay. Ultimately then, we would have to look back on those individual events, knowing the end of them. We would have to look back on those events as they transpired, even individually. And we would have to say that indeed they were good. not because of how they made us feel or what was presently going on, but because they were a necessary means for a particular end. And so they're good in that sense. And that's because they are going to produce something that is much better than any single event could ever hope to produce. They are a necessary part of a whole. Okay? You've got to have that if you're going to have this, if that makes sense. Okay? Now, let's be very careful and very delicate here. That does not mean that the pain of those events has ever disappeared. Okay? And let's talk here just for a moment. Let me just insert kind of a parenthetical. There is a difference in between what is proximate and what is ultimate. If something's in your proximity, what do we mean by that? Well, it means it's close to us. And so when something is in proximity, something is proximate to us, we understand it one way, but as a little bit of distance is created between us and the object, we may see it entirely different. And so proximate, again, is what is close at hand. And when something is proximate to us, here is where it hurts the worst. Here's where the pain really is intensified. It's a fresh, open wound. And it burns and it stings. And when the air blows upon it and when any salinity or salt is added into it, if anything touches it, it stings. It's fresh. It's close to us and it hurts all the more. But as a little bit of space, a little time goes by, you begin to see with an ultimate perspective. You have the privilege, I call it the privilege of hindsight. You have the privilege of looking back over those experiences and seeing how God was orchestrating and moving to do what He has done in your life. And let's be honest here. You and I will never understand everything in this life. We'll never see the entire ultimate big picture. But God is very kind and has graced us to allow us to begin to put those pieces together to see. And who knows, if those things had not have happened, where in the world would you be tonight? Well, that's a hypothetical that you and I can't fill in right now. But we can trust, again, that God is doing all things good or well. Again, that doesn't mean all the pain has disappeared, but it does mean that we are beginning to see all things work together as we get to that ultimate perspective. We're seeing the all things working together. Take, for instance, the story of Joseph for an example. When Joseph had gone through everything that he had gone through, when he had been envied, when his brothers had been jealous of him, when they had threw him down in the pit, when they had thought to kill him, when they sold him into slavery, when he had been taken down into Egypt, when he had been turned over, when he had been elevated, when he had been lied upon, when he had been forgotten, when he had been thrown into the prison again, put in ward, and when he's brought back up and decades are moving by. And finally, not at the end, but after enough time, enough space has been granted. When he moved beyond the proximate into an ultimate perspective because of the privilege of time, Joseph was able to say in Genesis chapter 50, verse number 20 to his brothers, "You thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good." In the proximate location, I can't believe my brothers would do this. I can't believe that I'm hearing them talk about killing me. I can't believe they would sell me to some Midianite passerbys. I can't believe that I would be sold into Egyptian slavery. I can't believe that I would rise again and be lied on and be thrown back into prison. I can't believe that all of this would happen, and it hurts, and why me, and why does this happen, and I miss my brothers, I miss my family, I miss my father, I miss my mother, I miss all of these things. Think. His mother had died. He never knew his mother. This is a rough life. But as time goes by, Joseph is able to see now from an ultimate perspective, Well, God's been doing something beyond my wildest imagination. He had to put all these pieces into place to get me here, not just for my own benefit, not just so I could have a good job. No, God was putting all the pieces of Joseph's life together literally to save alive the world. You'll never see that in the proximate arena. It's just going to hurt. It's just going to be the wise. But farther along, Joseph had felt the evil. He had felt the pain. He had felt the badness. But now he was beginning to see the good. Again, had the pain vanished? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there were still the lost years. There were still things that had been lost that could never be recovered. I mean, there's a time period there where he just was away from it all, and he'll never get that back. But with time, he had began getting a grip on the ultimate plan of God, and he was able to see that losing out on those things and experiencing that kind of stuff has allowed for God to do something even greater in his life. And so we've seen the inclusion factor, all things. We've seen the ultimate factor that all those things work together. And now number 3 tonight, let's look at the contingency factor, okay? The contingency factor. To declare tonight that all things work together for good for everyone is not true. The Bible doesn't place such a blanket coverage on that many people. This promise that God will never allow anything bad to happen is reserved for a specific group of people with the following characteristics. Verse 28. To them, number 1, who love God, and who secondly are called according to His purpose. So simply put tonight, if you do not love God and or are not working to carry out His purposes, then you have no claim in this promise. If you're not a lover of God, and loving God is manifest in the reality that you live to keep His commandments. You delight to do His will. His commandments are not grievous. No, as a heart pants after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after Thee, O God. For the living God. I love You, I extol You, and I want to live for You. That's a love for God. And you're called according to His purpose, meaning that God has enlisted you into His service, being a member of His family, to do something for Him, to further His kingdom program, to serve in some capacity, to which God has called every believer into, as every man, Peter says, has received the gift. Even so minister to the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. 1 Peter chapter number 4. And so if you love God and you're called according to His purpose, this is generally understood as 2 characteristics that just simply really refer to genuine believers. Now you may get cold in your love towards God, but you still love Him. You may not be as active as you once were in fulfilling His commandments, His purposes, but you're still fulfilling His purposes in your life. Well, you love God, you're called according to His purpose. Well, what Paul is saying then is if you're a Christian, then nothing bad really can ever happen to you. Now, the flip side of this is also true. If you're not a Christian, then nothing good really can ever happen to you. Because the supposed goodness that you believe yourself to be enjoying, the pleasures that last for a season, will really eventually only serve as a witness against you on the day of judgment. Earlier inside of this same book, Romans chapter 2, Paul dealt with that very premise, picking up again in the middle of that chapter, Romans 2, beginning in verse number 4. Paul says, do you despise the riches of His goodness and His forbearance and His long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance. So the topic at hand is how good God has been to you, and He's speaking to individuals who have spurned that love, spurned that goodness. We take the goodness of God and we use it as an occasion to get further away from it. Now Paul goes on, verse number 5. After thy hardness and impenitent heart, you have treasured up unto thyself wrath against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Simply put, God has been kind to you in a general sense. His common grace has been shed upon you. Maybe that means you have an accumulated amount of wealth. Maybe you have an exceptional amount of good health about you, a long life, benefits, prosperity, success, whatever the case is, whatever you would deem to be something good and profitable in your life. If you have not, in turn, taken those blessings, those resources that God has given to you, and used them in a way to reflect the glory of God in your life, if you haven't done that, but rather you have taken the goodness of God and used it as a means of living for yourself and for this world, Paul says, well, that goodness in return is going to stand and speak against you on the day of judgment. It's going to say something like this: you took the goodness of God for granted. You live by the premise that you take the grace of God and you continue sinning because God just continues to give you breath. He continues to allow you to live. And you don't even have enough gratefulness and gratitude to just stop and say, I'm going to live for God in return. R.C. Sproul, in his book, Why Is There Evil?, just a small little booklet, made 4 distinctions on such experiences. I want to give those 4 distinctions to you tonight. I think they'll be a big help to you. They were to me as I was studying through this. 4 distinctions on such life experiences, okay? Number 1, he called the first distinction the good distinction, okay? Meaning good things happen and are used to bring about a further ultimate good. Now, this can only happen for believers. But it simply means that when something good has happened to you, you received a promotion, you received a raise in your salary, something good. You had children, you got married. Hopefully you got married and had children. But, just the blessing that comes along with those kinds of things. And you're prospering. Well, that's great. Praise God for that. Well, those good things for the child of God are going to serve only a greater purpose in your life. God's given you that goodness to further promote you so that you can do more for His kingdom and His glory. That's the good experience. And then he makes a second distinction. That is the bad experience. That's kind of where we want to stay away from, right? This is when bad things happen that only fuel the ultimate badness of eternity. This can only happen for the unbeliever. And so you have the unbeliever who something bad happens to him, some disease, some diagnosis, some tragic event. And really all that badness is a precursor of the ultimate badness he's going to experience when he dies and goes to hell. There's no light at the end of the tunnel there. There's a brighter day coming. There's no, it'll all be glory by and by. Not for the unbeliever. The badness that happens to him serves no greater purpose than again to just simply be a precursor for the awful judgment of eternity that awaits him. Well, then, you move into a couple of other distinctions here that are not quite as familiar to us. The third one he referred to as the good-bad experience. The good-bad experience. This is where something that is bad is done or has happened, but ultimate good is going to come from it. And again, we're back to what can only happen for the believer. As a believer, something bad in and of itself, what we would perceive an approximate venue, has happened to us, something bad. And so It happens and it hurts and it's painful and it stings and there's all kinds of questions that come out of that. But eventually, in time, something ultimately good is going to come from that bad experience of life. And so it's good, bad. And again, we could recall again by way of illustration, Joseph and his brothers. Joseph, as the believer there, had someone treat him in a very bad way, and he had some very bad things individually that took place in his life. But ultimately, God was doing something much greater in and from and through the life of Joseph. Well, we could also call to witness the manner in which Judas treated Jesus. Well, wasn't it a horrible thing that happened to Christ? I mean, he was betrayed by a friend, by someone that he had cared for and had used and had provided for. He wasn't just betrayed by a friend. He was betrayed by one of the most intimate acts of affection, with a kiss. What Jesus said about this man, it'd been better for him not even to have been born. That's bad. But what was bad that happened to Jesus has actually accomplished the greatest good that ever could have been accomplished. Because he was betrayed, he died on our behalf. So it's the good-bad experience. Again, that can only happen to believers. And then the fourth distinction here is the bad-good experience, which is an experience of something good happening to a person where that goodness will only work against them on the day of judgment, like we've already highlighted. This can only take place for the unbeliever. Something good happens. He gets a promotion. He gets a better job. He gets more money. He has great health. He lives a long life. He has everything going for him. He wins the lottery. He has as many children as he's ever wanted, and they all behave perfectly. I'm jealous already. But where's the good in it? You get a promotion. You make more money. And so because you have more money, you start buying beer. You have more money, so you buy a vacation home and you start missing church. Things start going well with you, or your kids follow in your footsteps. They become the athlete of the year. And so you stop going to church on Wednesday night because you have ball practice. Such goodness only leads to eternal badness. Okay. I think the iconic text there would be Mark 8, verse 36. What would it profit a man if he were to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? I think we have a tendency to stop there and just say, well, yeah, there would be no profit in that. And that's right. There wouldn't be no profit for everything to go well for you and for you to have everything that your heart could ever desire, and yet for you to die and go to hell. There's no profit in that. But I think Jesus really wanted us to catch the next level of that, and that would be this. That it's not just not profitable for you to have all of that resources, all of those resources given to you, and you not to seek Him. It's actually the most unprofitable thing that could happen to you. Because, again, all of that goodness is going to stand in judgment against you when you stand before God in the final day. So this promise of Romans 8:28 is made exclusively to the believer, and he alone can say that everything that is taking place in my life is producing the best good possible. That's the blanketed promise for the child of God. That God is literally always working all things together for good. If I love Him and I'm called according to His purpose, I'm being used to further His kingdom, then God will only use what's happening to me in my life for good. Never for bad. Never for evil. Never to destroy me. But to prosper me and to prosper His kingdom. So that leaves us with one final factor tonight. And we're going to call that the faith factor. Okay? So all of this can be true tonight. And while it's hard to swallow, and some of you may be sitting there just This is hard to really digest because we're so used to looking at our lives from a proximate point of view. And everything hurts and everything's bad. And so I get it. I know it's difficult. But all of it can be true, and all of it is true here from God's Word. But the blessing of Romans chapter 8, verse number 28 is not just in its reality, but I think the real blessing is found in its realization, okay? So notice with me back in our text, Romans 8, verse 28. Notice the first three words of Paul in verse 28. What does he say? And we know. Would you say that with me tonight? And we know. Say it again with me. And we know. Right? Paul says this is something that we are confident about. This isn't just something that's taking place subconsciously. This isn't just something that's happening without me being aware of it. No, Paul says, I am very aware of what's really taking place here. I am conscious of it. I live, Paul says, knowing this is true. And so Paul could later say that the light afflictions of this present world are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed hereafter. Paul is saying the isolated bad things that I may feel are bad in a proximate vicinity of me, where they're not even, those feelings are not even worthy to be compared with where all of that is eventually going to lead me to. And I know this. Paul says this isn't just something that's happening behind the scenes. This is on the script. As I'm living out this drama of life, it's literally written on my page as the bad experiences are happening. When that happens and this happens, you fill it in for yourself. See it off to the side. In the editor's notes, in the script, in the manual, it says, don't worry, I'm going to use this for good in your life. I know this. I live knowing this. But what a grace that has been given to us to have this knowledge as you and I go through these difficult experiences, that God is going to use what we would view as bad to accomplish the good. You know, God didn't have to do that. He didn't. He wasn't obligated to give us the blueprints to this thing. He wasn't. He could have just waited for us to get to heaven and then have shown us in hindsight from that mountain peak, hey, listen, I know you thought your whole entire life I was out against you and out to hurt you and destroy you, but here's how I was, really working and I was really out for your good. You just couldn't realize it at the time. He could have done that, but God in His grace and in His kindness has put in His Word for us to read before you go through those trials and when you're in those trials and even after you've come out of those trials, for you to be reassured tonight as a genuine believer. God writing you a personal note saying, don't worry. Don't fear. I'm doing this for your good. It may not make sense to you. You may not see all the pieces. There may not be enough space of time. The clouds may be still too thick. The fog may still be too low. But eventually it's going to lift. It's going to clear. And you're going to be able to see that all of this is working together with all the other events in your life to do something very good for you. And so in His kindness, He's made us aware of His intentions beforehand. And I believe one of the great reasons why He's done that is to give us strength as we go through the storm. Maybe you're here tonight and you have been, or maybe you are, or possibly you will be. I think somebody defined the Christian life like that. It's a pretty pessimistic viewpoint, but it may be a realist point of view. You've either just come out of a trial, you're in a trial, or you're about to go into a trial. We feel like that sometimes, and probably much of that is very true. But for the child of God, we have this promise from God where He is saying it's not an end in and of itself. I'm doing something much larger than you're presently able to see. And so the faith factor says it may sting right now and it may be painful and I may not have another tear to come out of my eyes. I may be dehydrated. My bed, as the psalmist said, may be soaked in tears. I may be sitting on an ash heap, scraping myself with a broken piece of pottery from the crown of my head to the sole of my feet, as was Job. And while I may not understand, I can say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Job's saying, I don't understand all of this right now. It's too close to me. But 38 chapters later, it didn't all make sense, but it had started making sense. Let me read to you one more verse and we're going to close tonight. Proverbs chapter 25 and verse number 4. The writer of Proverbs says this: take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Let me ask you a question tonight. How do you remove dross, impurities? How do you remove impurities from fine metals like silver? Well, you do it by heat. And the more intense the heat, the more impurities are exposed. Now, it's interesting to me. The heat alone doesn't remove the impurities. The heat reveals the impurities. They must then be swept off from the surface. You know what the moments of intense heat, of fire, do for us in our life? They reveal the impurities. You go through those hardships of life and you lash out against church members. You blame everybody else in the world but yourself for what's happened. You're envious because someone else hasn't gone through the same thing that you're going through. You're mad at the world. Everybody else is to blame. Maybe you're even mad at God. You slack off your giving to the Lord through the church because you're just mad at God. You slack off coming to church. You're not as faithful. Or maybe it's not quite that obvious. Maybe you're just skipping out on your Bible reading. Maybe the Bible has just become something you're not interested in. You know what? You know what's being revealed to you in the moments of those intense, difficult seasons of your life? The impurities. You didn't know they were there. You thought you loved the brethren. You thought you would never have any malice in your heart. You thought you would never skip out on God. You thought you would never act in that way. You thought you'd never have those sorts of feelings because they were so embedded down below the surface, you didn't see them. But God in His kindness applied the heat. He cut the oven up. The fire got hotter. And the hotter that it's gotten, the more you've seen that you're not quite as perfect as you thought you were. Well, you're at a crossroads then. Because you can just leave the impurities on the surface. And quite frankly, if you do that, they're there for all of us to see. Well, that's what God noticed about Cain, isn't it? He got put into the fire where God didn't accept his sacrifice, but He accepted his brother's sacrifice. And immediately what surfaced through that moment, through that trial, is that he has jealousy and he has indignation. He doesn't have a true loyalty to God. But beforehand, everybody probably thought that Cain loved God just as much as Abel. I mean, they're both working and laboring to do so. They're both going to church. They're both going to sacrifice. But all of a sudden it surfaces to the extent where maybe he used to hug his brother every night before they went to bed. Now he's murdered him. And the dross, the impurities are still all there on the surface. To where all God has to do is just cast a glance in Cain's direction. And He sees all the impurities of his life and He says, Cain, why is your countenance fallen? It's written all over your face, Cain, that you're not dealing with the issue at hand. So when the fires of life reveal the impurities, our responsibility is to take through prayer, through confession, through going to our brothers and sisters in Christ and asking for their forgiveness and whatever else may be necessary to sweep across the top and get all of those impurities off that God has revealed to us. And the writer of Proverbs says, when you take away the dross from the silver, there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. See, God's using those episodes in your life not to make you bitter, but to make you better. Is it a possibility that you'll just simply become bitter? Yeah, sure. A lot of people have. A lot of people just ignore, get comfortable with the dross on top. But that's not the design of the fire. God is making something more beautiful out of the substance of your life and my life than we could ever imagine. We just have to learn not to fight against Him in the process. Okay? Let's stand tonight for prayer.